Before Firebase Ripcord became one of the bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War, it had already become the most dangerous place in the country, not because of the soldiers defending it, not because of the mountain itself, but because of a simple realization made by the North Vietnamese army. They didn't need to capture the base. They didn't even need to attack it. All they had to do was stop the helicopters. Once they did, every American on that mountain would be trapped. For 23 days, helicopters flew into one of the deadliest landing zones of the entire Vietnam War. Pilots knew they would be shot at. Crew chiefs expected to return with bullet holes. Some aircraft landed with shattered windshields. Others never landed at all. Every flight became a gamble. Every landing became a race against death. And every soldier standing on Firebase Ripcord understood one terrifying fact. If the helicopters stopped coming, they weren't going home. The story begins months before the siege itself. In early 1970, American commanders were preparing one final series of operations inside the A Shau Valley. Few places in Vietnam carried a reputation quite like it. Stretching along the Laotian border, the valley served as one of North Vietnam's most important logistical corridors. Men, weapons, food, mortars. Entire units disappeared into its jungle and emerged hundreds of miles away. American bombers pounded the valley almost daily. Thousands of tons of explosives fell there every month, yet little seemed to change. The jungle absorbed everything. From the air, the valley looked almost untouched. Military planners believed the answer wasn't another bombing campaign. It was elevation. High above the valley stood Dong Ray Lao Mountain. From its summit, artillery could reach deep into enemy territory. Forward observers could watch movement through the valley. Helicopters could launch assaults where roads didn't exist. On paper, the mountain looked perfect. On the ground, it was a nightmare. The summit barely offered enough flat ground for a helicopter to land. Everything else dropped away into steep jungle-covered slopes. Morning fog swallowed the mountain almost every day. Clouds drifted across the ridgeline without warning. Pilots often couldn't see the landing zone until the final seconds of approach. That should have been the first warning. Instead, construction began. Engineers from the 101st Airborne Division hacked a clearing out of the jungle. Trees fell. Bulldozers carved roads where no roads had existed. Artillery positions appeared. Sandbag bunkers spread across the ridge. Within weeks, Firebase Ripcord existed. Officially, it was another temporary fire support base. Unofficially, it had just been placed directly in the path of one of North Vietnam's most experienced divisions. They noticed almost immediately. Hidden observers watched helicopters arrive every day. They counted artillery pieces, they marked landing zones, they watched patrol routes. Unlike many famous battles of Vietnam, there would be almost no surprise here. Both sides knew exactly where the other was. Both sides understood why the mountain mattered. The only thing left to decide was who would break first. Most people imagined battles beginning with explosions. Ripcord didn't. It began with silence. Patrols moving through jungle that seemed strangely empty. Fresh footprints appearing on muddy trails. Cooking fires that had gone cold only minutes earlier. Abandoned bunkers, recently cut branches. Someone was always nearby. Yet almost nobody was ever seen. Veterans later described the feeling as being hunted. The mountain wasn't surrounded. It was being studied. Then came the first sniper shots. One round, hours of silence, another round. Mortars followed. Not enough to destroy anything. Just enough to remind everyone on the mountain that they had been found. Some soldiers joked the North Vietnamese were checking whether they were awake. Nobody laughed for long, because every incoming shell revealed something. Where men ran, where medics gathered, where artillery crews took cover. The bombardments weren't random. They were reconnaissance. The enemy was learning the mountain one explosion at a time. The Americans had something the North Vietnamese desperately wanted to destroy. Not the artillery, not the bunkers, not even the infantry, the helicopters. Everything depended on them. Every gallon of drinking water arrived by air. Every artillery shell. Every ration. Every replacement soldier. Every wounded man leaving the mountain. Ripcord had no roads, no supply convoys, no backup route. Remove the helicopters, and the mountain became a prison. The North Vietnamese understood that long before the Americans did. Instead of preparing one massive assault, they prepared something much smarter. They began building a ring of machine gun positions around the mountain, not on the summit. On the ridge lines, every helicopter had to cross. The pilots never saw them being built. One day, the approaches were quiet. The next, they had become killing zones. One Huey pilot later described the final approach as flying into a stadium where every spectator had a rifle. The moment helicopters cleared the last ridgeline, the jungle erupted. Green tracers climbed toward the aircraft from every direction. Door gunners answered with long bursts into trees they couldn't even see through. Pilots didn't maneuver. They couldn't. Turning exposed the helicopter's side. Hovering meant certain death. The only option was forward. Land. Unload. Load the wounded. Get out. Sometimes the entire stop lasted less than 20 seconds. Then another helicopter came, then another. Every crew flew exactly the same route. Every enemy gunner already knew where they would appear. The trap wasn't closing, it had already closed. The only question now was how long the men on Firebase Ripcord could survive inside it. By early July, the mountain had developed its own routine. Wake before sunrise, wait for the first incoming mortar, count the helicopters, count the wounded. Repeat. No one on Ripcord talked about surviving until the end of the tour anymore. They talked about surviving the week. Sometimes, just surviving the day felt ambitious enough. What made Ripcord different wasn't the number of attacks. Vietnam had seen larger battles, bigger bombardments, longer sieges. What made Ripcord terrifying was that there was almost no safe moment. Even silence became suspicious. When the mortars stopped, men looked toward the jungle. When the jungle fell silent, they looked toward the sky, because something was always coming. The North Vietnamese weren't wasting ammunition. Every shell had a purpose. Some landed near artillery positions, others targeted the landing zone, a few struck command bunkers. It wasn't random harassment, it was calibration. Each barrage told them something: which bunkers were occupied, how long it took engineers to repair damage, how quickly medics reached the wounded. Even the helicopters revealed valuable information: how long they stayed on the ground, where they parked, which direction they escaped. Without realizing it, every American response was teaching the enemy how to attack more effectively the next day. Then the weather turned against them. Low clouds rolled over Dong Ray Lao Mountain almost every morning. Pilots sometimes couldn't even see the landing zone until they were seconds away from touching down. Normally, poor weather protected helicopters. Not here. The clouds forced them lower, slower, exactly where the waiting machine guns wanted them. One pilot later admitted that the approach felt backwards. Usually, reaching the landing zone meant you had survived. At Ripcord, the landing zone was the most dangerous part of the flight. Imagine flying a helicopter toward a mountain you can't fully see. Your windshield is filled with fog. Somewhere below are exhausted soldiers waiting for ammunition. Somewhere ahead are enemy gunners who already know exactly where you're coming from. Then the first tracer appears, another follows, then dozens. Bright green lines climbing straight towards your cockpit. You don't know which gun fired first. You don't even know how many guns there are. All you know is that every second you stay airborne increases the chance that someone behind you won't make it home. For the infantry, life wasn't much better. American patrols continued pushing down the slopes every single day. Their orders sounded simple: find the machine guns, destroy them, come back. The jungle made that almost impossible. Visibility rarely exceeded 30 yards, sometimes less. Enemy bunkers were hidden beneath layers of logs, dirt, and vegetation. You could walk within meters of one and never know it was there until it opened fire. Veterans described the first burst as almost always winning, not because the North Vietnamese were better shots, because they chose when the battle started. 1 second, the patrol was walking; the next, the jungle exploded. Machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, AK-47s firing from positions nobody had seen. The first instinct wasn't to shoot back, it was to find the ground. Men disappeared into the mud. Radio operators called desperately for artillery. Medics crawled forward while bullets ripped leaves from branches overhead. Sometimes the firefight lasted 5 minutes, sometimes 5 hours, often. The Americans left without ever seeing the bunker they had been fighting. Back on the summit, another problem was becoming impossible to ignore: artillery. The 6 105mm howitzers had been placed on Ripcord for one reason: to dominate the valley, and they did. Whenever patrols found enemy positions, the guns answered. Whenever helicopters came under fire, the guns answered. Whenever mortars landed on the base, the guns answered. Day after day, The artillery became the heartbeat of Ripcord. Then the North Vietnamese changed their tactics. Instead of targeting the infantry, they started hunting the guns. Observers hidden in the jungle waited for the flash of a firing howitzer. Seconds later, enemy mortars came screaming back. The duel repeated itself over and over. Fire. Take cover. Repair the gun. Fire again. Some artillery crews later admitted they stopped counting how many times their positions had been hit. There was no point. If the gun still worked, they kept firing. By the middle of July, casualties were rising almost every day. Replacement soldiers landed on the mountain carrying clean uniforms. Within hours, they looked exactly like everyone else, covered in red clay, smoke, sweat, exhaustion. Sleep became a luxury. No one removed their boots before lying down. Helmets stayed within arm's reach. Rifles remained loaded. One mortar round was enough to end any attempt at normal routine. The mountain demanded constant attention, and eventually, constant attention became impossible. Men forgot conversations they had the day before. Some couldn't remember whether they had eaten. Others woke in panic because, for a brief moment, they couldn't hear incoming fire. The silence frightened them more than the explosions, because silence usually meant something bigger was on its way. Then came the report every commander feared. More enemy troops had entered the area. Not a patrol, not a platoon, entire companies. American reconnaissance aircraft confirmed movement through the jungle west of the mountain. Intercepted radio traffic suggested the North Vietnamese weren't preparing to leave. They were preparing to finish the job. Inside Ripcord, nobody needed intelligence reports to understand what was happening. They could feel it. Mortars were becoming more accurate. Machine guns were appearing in new locations. Helicopters were taking more hits than ever before. The noose around the mountain wasn't tightening anymore. It was almost closed. And somewhere beyond the tree line, hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers were waiting for the moment to strike. They believed time was finally on their side. For the first time since the siege began, they were right. By July 18th, Firebase Ripcord had already survived nearly 3 weeks of relentless attacks. The men on the mountain had stopped asking when the siege would end. Instead, they wondered what would fail first: the bunkers, the artillery, the helicopters, or themselves. Then, just after noon, everything changed. A CH-47 Chinook was making its approach to the summit. The giant transport helicopter had made flights like this before. It carried exactly what Ripcord desperately needed: ammunition, supplies, the fuel to keep the mountain alive. For the crew, it was another dangerous mission. For the North Vietnamese, it was the target they had been waiting for. As the Chinook crossed the final ridgeline, the jungle erupted. Heavy machine guns opened fire almost simultaneously from multiple directions. Tracer rounds climbed toward the aircraft. The pilots kept flying. They had no choice. Aborting the landing meant leaving hundreds of soldiers without supplies. Continuing meant flying directly through the storm. They chose to continue. The helicopter reached the summit. For one brief moment, it looked like it might actually make it. Then came another burst. The Chinook shuddered. Witnesses later described the aircraft beginning to yaw violently as critical systems failed. The crew fought desperately to keep it under control. They almost did. Almost. Instead of stopping on the landing pad, the helicopter slammed into the firebase. What happened next lasted only seconds, but it changed the battle forever. The aircraft crashed directly into the artillery position. Moments later, thousands of pounds of 105mm ammunition detonated. The explosion ripped across the summit. One shell ignited another, then another. Within seconds, the entire artillery position became a chain reaction. Men were thrown to the ground, sandbags disappeared into clouds of dirt and smoke, pieces of steel rained across the mountain. Veterans would later say they believed an entire airstrike had hit the base. It hadn't. One helicopter had accidentally destroyed the heart of Firebase Ripcord. When the smoke finally began to clear, the scale of the disaster became obvious. The 6 howitzers that had protected the mountain for weeks were gone. Some had been destroyed outright. Others were so badly damaged they could no longer fire. Ammunition burned uncontrollably. The blast had scattered shells across the firebase, making parts of the summit too dangerous to enter. The guns that had answered every attack had suddenly fallen silent. For the first time since the siege began, Ripcord was almost without artillery support. Down in the jungle, the North Vietnamese noticed immediately. American guns had defined the rhythm of the battle. Now, they weren't firing. The opportunity they had spent weeks creating had finally arrived. Mortars began falling again. Machine guns intensified their fire. Patrols reported increased enemy movement on the surrounding slopes. The pressure never stopped. It increased. Inside the command bunker, officers faced a reality no one wanted to admit. The mountain could still be defended, but doing so would now cost far more than anyone had expected. Every damaged gun had to be replaced by helicopter. Every crate of ammunition would have to be flown back in. Every wounded soldier still needed evacuation. And every helicopter attempting to land would fly through the same deadly ring of machine guns. The mathematics of the battle had changed. Every flight now carried greater risk, for less reward. The pilots understood it before anyone told them. One veteran later recalled that crews had stopped asking whether they would be shot at. They only asked how many times. Some helicopters landed with so many bullet holes that mechanics counted them instead of repairing them immediately. Fuel tanks were patched overnight, hydraulic lines replaced, rotor blades inspected. Then the aircraft flew straight back into the same valley the next morning. Mission after mission, because nobody else could reach the men on Ripcord. One medevac crew later described the landing zone as 30 seconds of controlled chaos. The helicopter touched down. Door gunners fired continuously into the jungle. Medics pulled wounded soldiers aboard without speaking. Nobody needed instructions anymore. Everyone knew the drill. Lift, turn, dive away from the summit. Pray the engine kept running. Sometimes the helicopter reached safety. Sometimes it didn't. Every successful evacuation meant another crew would volunteer to return. Every failed one reminded them exactly what the price could be. Back on the mountain, fatigue was becoming the enemy no one could shoot. Some soldiers had gone days without meaningful sleep. Faces disappeared beneath layers of dirt and gunpowder. Beards grew unchecked. Uniforms tore apart from weeks of crawling through rock and mud. Nobody cared anymore. The only thing that mattered was making it to tomorrow, then making it to the day after that. One infantryman later admitted something almost impossible to imagine. He said he had become so used to incoming mortars that when they stopped, he couldn't sleep. The silence felt wrong, more dangerous than the explosions, because silence usually meant the enemy was moving. By July 20th, the commanders of the 101st Airborne began confronting a question they had avoided for weeks. Not whether Ripcord could still fight. It could. Not whether the soldiers still had the will. They did. The question was much colder than that. Was the mountain still worth the lives required to hold it? That answer would decide the fate of Firebase Ripcord. On July 22nd, the battle had reached a point where courage was no longer the deciding factor. The men on Firebase Ripcord were still fighting, the helicopters were still flying, the artillery crews were still firing the guns that remained, but every report arriving at headquarters said the same thing. More casualties, more damaged aircraft, more enemy troops moving toward the mountain. The siege wasn't ending. It was growing. Commanders now faced a decision no battlefield manual could answer. Hold the mountain or save the men. From the beginning, Ripcord had never been intended as a permanent base. Its purpose was to support operations in the A Shau Valley. But by late July, the mission itself had changed. Instead of supporting operations, the operation had become supporting Ripcord. Helicopters weren't bringing supplies for new offensives anymore. They were bringing supplies simply to keep the mountain alive for another day. The base had become its own mission, and that was never the plan. Late that evening, the order finally came. Firebase Ripcord would be evacuated. Not because the defenders had been defeated, not because the North Vietnamese had captured the summit, but because the cost of holding it had become greater than its military value. For the soldiers who had spent weeks bleeding for every yard of ground, it was almost impossible to accept. Friends had died protecting those bunkers. Pilots had risked everything landing there. Engineers had rebuilt the same defensive positions over and over again under mortar fire. Now, they were leaving. The evacuation had to happen fast. Every soldier still on the mountain had to be flown out. Sensitive equipment had to be destroyed, documents burned, communications gear dismantled. Whatever couldn't be carried away had to be left useless. The North Vietnamese were watching every movement. If they realized the Americans were leaving, the evacuation could turn into a massacre. At first light, the helicopters returned, the same route, the same narrow approach, the same machine guns waiting in the jungle. Nothing had changed, except this time, every flight carried men home. The landing zone became a blur of movement. Rotor wash filled the air with red dust. Soldiers ran crouched beneath spinning blades. Crew chiefs grabbed rucksacks and pulled exhausted infantrymen into the aircraft. Nobody wasted a second. Nobody looked back. As one helicopter lifted away, another was already descending. The mountain had become an assembly line racing against time. Then the enemy realized what was happening. Mortars crashed across the summit. Machine guns opened fire from multiple ridgelines. Tracers reached toward every helicopter climbing away from Ripcord. Pilots banked hard through valleys they knew were covered by enemy guns. Some helicopters absorbed round after round. Warning lights flashed across instrument panels. Hydraulic systems leaked. Cockpits filled with the smell of burning oil and gunpowder. Still, they kept flying, because somewhere below, another group of Americans was still waiting. One pilot would later say something that perfectly captured those final hours. The hardest part wasn't flying into Ripcord. The hardest part was leaving while other men were still standing on that mountain. Every departure meant someone else had to wait for the next helicopter, and no one knew if there would be a next helicopter. By the afternoon of July 23rd, the summit was almost empty. The artillery that had dominated the valley was silent. The bunkers stood abandoned. A few final demolition charges echoed across the ridgeline. Equipment the Americans couldn't carry exploded where it stood. The last helicopters lifted off. Within minutes, Firebase Ripcord ceased to exist. The North Vietnamese eventually occupied the mountain. But what they found wasn't the victory they had expected. The Americans hadn't surrendered, they hadn't been overrun, they had simply disappeared. After 23 days of relentless combat, the summit belonged to no one. Only the jungle remained. The battle cost the United States dearly. Dozens of Americans were killed, hundreds more were wounded. Helicopter crews flew some of the most dangerous missions of the Vietnam War. Entire infantry companies left the mountain with barely half the men they had started with. The North Vietnamese paid heavily as well, but unlike many famous battles, Ripcord produced no decisive victory, no dramatic turning point, no moment that changed the outcome of the war. And perhaps that's exactly why history forgot it, only 6 years earlier. Americans had fought for another hill, Hamburger Hill. The photographs appeared on front pages around the world. Politicians debated whether the sacrifice had been worth it. Ripcord received no such attention. By 1970, America was already trying to leave Vietnam. The public had grown tired of hearing about another mountain, another firefight, another list of casualties. While the men of the 101st Airborne were still fighting for their lives, most Americans had already stopped paying attention. Today, if you stand where Firebase Ripcord once stood, you won't find trenches, you won't find artillery positions, or burned helicopters. The jungle reclaimed the mountain long ago. Trees now grow where soldiers once fought. Rain washes across ground that once shook under thousands of artillery rounds. Nature has done what neither army could. It erased the battlefield. But memory works differently. For the veterans who survived, Ripcord never disappeared. Some still remember the sound of rotor blades echoing through the clouds. Others remember counting the seconds between mortar rounds. Many remember looking toward the landing zone every morning, hoping today's helicopter would arrive. Because on Firebase Ripcord, a helicopter didn't just bring ammunition, or food, or mail from home. It brought something even more valuable, the possibility of living one more day. History often remembers the battles that changed wars, but sometimes the battles worth remembering are the ones that changed the people who fought them. Firebase Ripcord didn't decide the outcome of Vietnam. It didn't become a Hollywood movie. It didn't enter history textbooks the way Khe Sanh or Ia Drang did. Instead, it became something quieter. A mountain where ordinary soldiers endured 23 days that felt endless. A battle won by endurance more than glory. A place where every helicopter landing was a small miracle, and where every departure meant someone else still had to wait. Perhaps that's why so few people remember Ripcord today, not because it wasn't important, but because history has a habit of celebrating victories while quietly forgetting survival. 23 days, one mountain, hundreds of lives forever changed, and one battle America almost forgot.